The wind coming down off the high granite peaks of the Colorado Rockies in late 1886 carried the smell of snow long before the clouds turned gray. Jonah Crow rode into the county seat of Silverton with that scent filling his nose. His collar turned up against a biting chill that seemed to have followed him all the way from the Canadian border. He rode a bay gelding that was more bone and grit than beauty. And Jonah himself looked much the same. He was a man whittled down by months on a solitary trap line, lean as a rail, with eyes the color of flint that moved constantly, scanning rooftops and alleyways with the habit of a man who expected trouble to find him. Jonah did not like towns. He did not like the noise of them, the clatter of carriage wheels on hard-packed mud, or the way people stared at a man who wore buckskin stained with pine pitch and elk blood. But a man could not live on silence alone forever. He needed supplies, and more than that, he needed land. He was tired of drifting like smoke. He wanted a place where he could close a door and know that the ground beneath his boots belonged to him by law, written out in ink and filed in a ledger where no one could tear it out. He tied his horse at the hitching rail outside the county courthouse, ignoring the looks from two men in suits who stepped aside as if Jonah carried a plague. He was used to it. He was a man of the mountains, a creature of the high lonesome, and to the townfolk, he was something wild and unsettling, a mountain savage who had forgotten how to be civilized. Inside the courthouse, the air was stale and smelled of old paper and cigar smoke. The auction was already underway, a dreary affair presided over by a clerk with ink-stained fingers and a voice that droned like a trapped fly. A handful of locals stood around, mostly land speculators and cattlemen looking for grazing rights, their boots scraping restlessly on the floorboards. The clerk cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. Item number 42, the clerk read, looking down at the paper with a sneer curling his lip. A cabin in claim on Black Pine Ridge, seized for tax default 3 years past. A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd. Jonah watched them, his face impassive. He knew Black Pine Ridge. It was high country, brutal and unforgiving, buried in snow for 6 months of the year. The trail up was a goat path that washed out every spring. The clerk looked up, scanning the room. Do I hear a bid for this property? It includes the structure, such as it is, and 20 acres of vertical rock. The room remained silent. A man in a bowler hat spat into a brass cuspidor near Jonah's boot. You could not pay me to take that place, the man muttered. It is cursed. Old man who lived there died crazy, and the wind up there screams like a banshee. The clerk sighed, clearly expecting this outcome. Come now, gentlemen. The timber rights alone must be worth a $5. Silence stretched out. The clerk raised his gavel. Ready to pass the lot. $1, Jonah said. His voice was a low rasp, unused to shaping words for other people. The heads of the men in the room turned toward him in unison. The clerk looked over his spectacles, squinting at Jonah standing in the shadows at the back of the room. $1, the clerk repeated, a dry chuckle in his throat. You represent yourself, sir. I do, Jonah said. He stepped forward, the light from the high windows catching the scar that ran from his jaw into his hairline, a souvenir from a life he tried not to remember. The clerk looked at the other men, inviting them to mock the stranger. But something in Jonah's stillness made the laughter die in their throats. Very well, the clerk said, sounding bored. $1 for the Black Pine Ridge parcel. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. Sold to the drifter for $1, the clerk announced. Step forward and sign your mark. Jonah walked to the desk. He did not sign with a mark. He took the pen and wrote Jonah Crow in a sharp, angular hand that surprised the clerk. He slapped a silver dollar onto the desk. It rang loud and clear. It is a fool's errand, the clerk said as he stamped the deed. That roof likely collapsed 2 winters ago. You are buying a grave. Mr. Jonah took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his coat. It is my grave to buy, Jonah said. He turned and walked out, feeling the eyes of the town on his back. He heard the whispers starting before the door even swung shut. That is the one they call the Blood Man. Does not belong here. savage. Jonah set his jaw. He had heard the words before. He had heard them in army camps and trading posts, in saloons and churches. He was a man who walked between worlds, belonging to neither the white settlements nor the tribes his grandmother had come from. He was used to being punished simply for existing. He went to the general store next, moving with efficiency. He needed to be up the mountain before the weather turned. He bought a sack of flour, a bag of salt, 5 pounds of coffee beans, a small keg of nails, and a cast-iron grate for a stove. The storekeeper, a man with watery eyes and a red nose, tallied the bill. "That'll be $12, the storekeeper said, looking not at Jonah but at the wall behind him. Jonah knew the price was high. He knew a sack of flour did not cost that much, even this far west. He looked at the storekeeper, and for a second, the air between them grew tight. The storekeeper shifted his weight, his hand drifting toward the counter where men usually kept a scattergun. Jonah did not argue. Arguing would mean staying, and staying meant trouble. He reached into his pouch and counted out the coins, placing them on the counter with deliberate care. He paid the tax on their hatred without flinching. "I will take a box of cartridges too," Jonah said. $45.70. The storekeeper put the box on the counter, taking the money quickly, as if Jonah's touch might taint the silver. "You headed up to the ridge?" the storekeeper asked, unable to help his curiosity. Jonah nodded once. "Storm coming," the man said. "A big one. You will be cut off until spring if you are not careful." Jonah did not answer. He gathered his supplies, hefted the heavy sack of flour onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing, and walked out into the gray afternoon. The climb to Black Pine Ridge was a punishment. As Jonah guided the gelding up the switchbacks, the air grew thin and cold, biting at the bottom of his lungs. The trees here were ancient pines, twisted by the wind, their roots clawing at the rocky soil like desperate fingers. The silence deepened with every mile, a heavy, living silence that swallowed the sound of the horses' hooves. By the time he reached the plateau where the cabin stood, the sun was sinking behind the peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and blood orange. The wind was howling now, driving snow that stung his face like grit. Jonah pulled his coat tighter and narrowed his eyes. There it was. The cabin sat in a small clearing, backed against a sheer cliff face that offered some protection from the north wind. It was rougher than he had hoped. The logs were weather-scarred and gray, the chinking falling out in places. The front porch sagged dangerously to the left, and the roof was patched with flattened tin cans and sod. It looked abandoned. It looked like a husk left behind by a dead world. Jonah felt a grim satisfaction. It was a ruin, but it was his ruin. He dismounted, tying the horse to a sapling. He would need to build a shelter for the animal, but for tonight, he would bring the beast into the lee of the wall. He walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the frozen crust of snow. He reached for the latch, his mind already cataloging the work he would need to do. Fix the roof, shore up the porch, mud the chimney. Then he stopped. He stood perfectly still, his breath clouding in front of his face, his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked onto the chimney. A thin wisp of smoke, barely visible against the gray sky, was breathing from the flue. Jonah's hand went instantly to the knife at his belt. He did not draw it, but he rested his palm on the handle. The clerk had said the place was empty, abandoned. He looked at the ground near the porch steps. The wind was scrubbing the earth, but it had not yet erased the signs. There were boot prints, small ones, and a line dragged through the snow, like a sled or a travois. Someone was inside. Jonah approached the door like a man expecting a trap. He did not stomp his feet to clear the snow. He moved with the rolling, silent gait of a hunter. He stepped onto the porch, avoiding the rotting planks he had spotted earlier, and stood by the door. He listened. From inside, he heard the faint scrape of metal on iron. Someone was tending a stove. Jonah did not knock. He owned this door. He lifted the latch and pushed it open, stepping inside quickly, scanning the room in a single heartbeat. The interior was dim, lit only by the orange glow of the stove and a single kerosene lamp turned low. The air smelled of wood smoke and something sharper. Fear. In the corner, rising from a crude chair, was a woman. She was small, thin to the point of gauntness, dressed in a faded wool dress that had been mended a dozen times. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a tight braid that fell over her shoulder. But Jonah did not look at her hair. He looked at the Winchester rifle she had leveled at his chest. Her hands were shaking, the barrel wavering in the air, but her finger was curled tight around the trigger. "Get out," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not scream. It was the steady, flat voice of someone who had learned that screaming did nothing to stop bad things from happening. Jonah stopped, his hands held away from his body, palms open. He was a large man, filling the doorway, blocking the fading light. He saw her eyes widen as she took in his size, his knife, the rough look of him. He saw something else, too. He saw the dark purple bruises encircling her wrists, stark against her pale skin. He saw the way she favored her left side, as if her ribs were taped. He saw the hollows under her cheekbones that spoke of hunger. "I said, get out," she repeated, shifting her grip on the rifle. "I will shoot." Jonah believed her. He had seen cornered animals before. They were the most dangerous kind. "This is my cabin," Jonah said, his voice low and rumbling in the small room. "I bought the deed at the auction in town today." The woman blinked, confusion flickering across her face, but the rifle did not lower. "You are lying," she said. "Nobody buys this place. It is cursed." "I paid $1 for it," Jonah said. "I have the paper in my pocket." He moved his hand slowly toward his coat. "Stop," she snapped. The barrel steadied on his heart. Jonah froze. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was Métis, he guessed, by the set of her eyes and the high cut of her cheekbones. She had the look of the mixed-blood families who worked the fur trade up north. She was beautiful, in a haunted, broken way. But right now she looked like she was made of wire and glass, ready to shatter. "I am not going to hurt you," Jonah said. "That is what they all say," she replied bitterly. Outside, the wind gusted, rattling the loose shingles on the roof. The temperature was dropping fast. If he went back down the mountain now, in the dark and the storm, he would likely freeze or his horse would break a leg. "Look," Jonah said, reasonable. "The storm is coming. A bad one. I have a horse outside that needs shelter. I have food." At the word food, her eyes flickered to the sack of flour he had dropped on the porch. The hunger in her expression was raw and unguarded. "I am not leaving," Jonah said. "I own this roof, but I am not going to throw you out in a blizzard." She watched him, her mind working behind her dark eyes. She was weighing the danger of the man against the danger of the winter. She looked at his hands, then at his face. She seemed to be searching for the cruelty she expected to find there. "Put your knife on the table," she said. Jonah hesitated. A man did not give up his blade, but he looked at the bruise on her wrist again. He reached to his belt, unbuckled the sheath, and laid the heavy knife on the rough-hewn table in the center of the room. "The rifle," he said, "pointed at the floor." She did not lower it completely, but she angled it away from his chest, keeping it ready. "You stay on that side of the room," she said. Jonah nodded. He stepped back out to the porch, grabbed his supplies, and hauled them inside. He kicked the door shut against the wind, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The sudden silence in the room was heavy. He began to unpack, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. He set the flour, the coffee, and the beans on the floor. He saw her watching the food as if it were gold. "What is your name?" Jonah asked, breaking the silence. She hesitated. "Emily," she said softly. "Millie, Jonah Crow." He said. He looked around the single room. It was sparse. There was a narrow bed in the corner with a straw tick mattress and one good wool blanket, a rusted stove, a shelf with a few jars of dried beans that looked mostly empty. On the table sat a battered Bible and a small tin. The lid was open, revealing a few sewing needles and a spool of thread. "You live here alone?" Jonah asked. Millie's chin went up. "I do now." She did not elaborate, and Jonah did not ask. He saw a loose floorboard near the hearth that sat slightly higher than the others. as if something was wedged beneath it. But he filed that away for later. The wind howled again. A long, mournful sound that shook the logs. Snow hissed against the single window pane. "We need wood," Jonah said. He went to the stove and checked the firebox. It was low. He added a few sticks from the small pile next to it. Millie watched him, her body tense, coiled tight. Night fell like a hammer. The cabin grew dark except for the pool of light from the lamp. Jonah took his bedroll and unrolled it in the far corner, the coldest part of the room, near the drafty door. He wanted to show her he kept his word. Millie sat on the edge of the bed, the rifle across her lap. She did not lie down. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on him. "Go to sleep," Jonah said, stretching out on the hard floor. "I am not going to touch you. I will stay awake," she said. Jonah closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. He lay there, listening to the storm build. The wind was screaming now, tearing at the trees outside. It was the kind of night that buried mistakes and hid secrets. Hours passed. The fire popped and hissed. Jonah's breathing evened out, feigning sleep, though his hand rested near the Colt revolver in his coat pocket. Then he heard it. It was not the wind. It was a sound distinct from nature, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of snow under multiple boots, voices muffled by the gale, shouting to be heard. Jonah's eyes snapped open. He sat up. Millie was already standing. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. "They are here," she whispered. Her voice broke. "They will drag me back." She looked at the door, then at the rifle, her hands shaking so hard the weapon rattled. She looked like she might turn the gun on herself rather than open that door. Jonah did not ask who they were. He did not ask what she had done. He looked at the terror in her face and made a choice that he did not fully understand. "Kill the light," he ordered. Millie froze. "Now," Jonah hissed. She blew out the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the faint red glow of the stove vents. Jonah moved fast. He crossed the room, grabbed the heavy quilt from the bed, and threw it over the stove to stifle the light, praying it wouldn't catch fire for a few minutes. He grabbed Millie by the arm. She flinched violently, but he pulled her down to the floor, behind the bulk of the table. "Quiet," he whispered. Not a sound. The voices were closer now. They were right outside the cabin. "I tell you, there is no one here," a man's voice shouted over the wind. "Look at the chimney. No smoke." "I thought I saw a light," another voice argued. "It is a reflection of the moon. You fool. There is no moon, but you know what I mean. Place is abandoned." Jonah smelled the drift of tobacco smoke seeping through the cracks in the logs. They were on the porch. He felt Millie trembling against him, a vibration so violent it felt like she was seizing. He put a heavy hand on her shoulder, pressing her down, grounding her. "Try the door," the second voice said. Jonah's hand moved to his revolver. He thumbed the hammer back. The click was swallowed by a gust of wind. The latch rattled. The heavy bar held, locked. The voice said, "Probably rusted shut." The first man replied, "Come on, my toes are black. If she is up here, the cold will take her by morning anyway. No woman survives a night like this without fire." There was a pause. Jonah held his breath. He felt Millie holding hers. The silence stretched, agonizing and thin. "Let's go," the voice said finally. "Back to town." The sheriff can send a deputy when the weather breaks. The sound of boots crunched away, fading into the howl of the storm. Jonah waited a long time. He waited until the only sound was the wind and the blood rushing in his own ears. He took the quilt off the stove before it scorched. He struck a match and lit the lamp, keeping the wick low. Millie was still on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her face buried in her arms. She was not crying. She was shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline. Jonah sat back on his heels, holstering his gun. He looked at her, this woman he had bought with a $1 cabin. He thought of the bruises, the fear, the men outside who spoke of her like she was prey. "They are gone," Jonah said quietly. Millie lifted her head. Her eyes were dark pools, unreadable and deep. She looked at Jonah. really seeing him for the first time. She looked at the gun he had drawn to defend her, at the position he had taken between her and the door. She took a breath, ragged and shivering. "I was told you would come," she whispered. Jonah frowned, his brow furrowing. "What?" "I was told," she repeated, her voice gaining a strange, fatalistic strength. "Etienne, the old man who lived here, before he died, he told me. He said to wait. He said a man would come who was stubborn enough to stay." Jonah stared at her. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He had bought this place on a whim, out of stubbornness, because a clerk had mocked him. "Who told you that?" Jonah asked. Millie looked at the door where the men had been, then back to Jonah. "He said you would be the only thing standing between me and the town," she said. "I have been waiting for you." Jonah looked around the drafty, rotting cabin. He heard the wind trying to tear the roof off. He looked at the woman who was hunted by men with tobacco and authority. He realized then that the dollar he had spent had not bought him isolation. It had bought him a war. The snow piled up against the door, sealing them in. Two strangers, trapped in the dark, with a winter ahead that would demand honesty, whether they wanted it or not. Jonah stood up and put another log on the fire. "Get some sleep. Millie," he said, his voice rough. "We are snowed in." He went back to his corner, wrapped himself in his coat, and watched the flames dance, wondering just what kind of fate he had walked into. The blizzard did not just cover the world, it erased it. For 3 days, the cabin on Black Pine Ridge existed in a void of white noise and biting cold, cut off from the earth below and the sky above. The days bled into nights, marked only by the gray shifting of the light against the frosted window pane and the rhythmic consumption of the woodpile. Survival settled into a routine that was less about living and more about refusing to die. Jonah Crow spent his hours waging war on the wood. He had found a stash of seasoned logs under the sagging porch, but they were frozen solid, hard as iron. He brought them inside to thaw near the stove, then split them with a hatchet, the sound of the blade biting into the wood cracking like pistol shots in the small room. His hands, already calloused from years on the trap line, began to split at the knuckles from the dry cold, bleeding sluggishly into the grain of the wood. Millie LaRue had her own war. She took charge of the interior with a quiet, fierce efficiency that Jonah had not expected. She melted snow in the heavy iron pot for water, straining it through a piece of clean cloth to catch the pine needles and grit. She took the flour Jonah had bought, the flour he had paid $12 for, and turned it into flat, dense biscuits cooked on the stovetop. They moved around each other like ghosts in a hallway, careful not to touch, careful not to speak more than necessary. They were roommates of necessity, bound by the lethal temperature outside rather than any shared goodwill. But Jonah was a man who noticed things. It was how he had stayed alive this long. He watched Millie when she thought he was sleeping or staring into the fire. He saw that she did not move like a town woman. There was no wasted motion in her. On the 4th day, Jonah brought in a snowshoe hare he had snared near the tree line before the worst of the snow hit. He tossed the frozen carcass onto the table. "I will dress it," Jonah said, reaching for his knife. Millie reached out and took the knife from the table before his hand could close around it. "Sit down, Jonah," she said. "You have been chopping wood for 4 hours. Your hands are shaking." Jonah stiffened, unused to being told what to do, but he watched as she took the hare. She did not flinch at the stiff limbs or the cold fur. She worked the knife with a surgeon's precision, skinning the animal and gutting it in clean, sure strokes. She wasted nothing. She saved the pelt to dry near the fire and set the meat to stew with the last of the dried beans. "You have done this before," Jonah said. It was not a question. Millie wiped the knife clean on a rag and set it down. "My father was a trapper," she said, her back to him as she stirred the pot. "Before the whiskey took his hands, he taught me how to use mine." Jonah watched her. He realized then that the town's assessment of her, helpless, cursed, trouble, was wrong. She was iron-wrapped in silk. Millie was studying him too. Jonah could feel her eyes on him when he sat by the fire, oiling his boots. She watched him the way a wounded animal studies a strange dog, trying to decide if he was there to guard the herd or tear out a throat. She noticed that he spoke little. He did not fill the silence with boastful noise like the men in the saloons down in the valley. When he did speak, he looked her in the eye. He did not look at her chest or her hips. He looked at her face, and his eyes, cold as they were, held no deception. The truce between them was fragile, made of silence and distance, until the chimney rebelled. It happened in the late afternoon. The wind shifted violently to the north, slamming a downdraft straight down the flue. The stove, which had been drawing poorly all day, suddenly belched a thick and black cloud of smoke into the room. Ash and soot exploded outward. The room instantly filled with choking, blinding gray fog. "Open the door," Jonah roared. He lunged for the stove. The metal was searing hot. He grabbed the handle of the firebox with his coat sleeve, but the heat seared through. He ignored the pain. The pipe was clogged or the damper had jammed. If he did not clear it, they would suffocate or burn. Millie threw the door open. The blizzard screamed in, a wall of freezing air colliding with the smoke. The temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees in a second. Jonah grabbed the stovepipe with his bare hands, wrenching it sideways to break the seal and clear the blockage. The metal hissed against his palms. He coughed, his eyes streaming water, his lungs burning. "Get back!" Jonah yelled, trying to wave Millie away from the soot. She did not move back. She was right beside him, holding a wet rag over her mouth with one hand and using the other to steady the base of the stove while Jonah fought the pipe. She did not scream. She did not panic. She worked together. They wrestled the pipe back into alignment, clearing the soot blockage with a violent shake that sent sparks cascading onto the floorboards. Jonah stomped them out with his heavy boots, while Millie slammed the door shut against the storm. The silence returned, but the air was acrid and cold. Jonah stood by the stove, his chest heaving, his hands throbbing where the metal had blistered his skin. He looked at Millie. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes bright and watering, her braid coming undone. She looked at his hands. "You are burned," she said. "It is nothing," Jonah rasped, wiping his face with his sleeve. "It is not nothing," she said firmly. She went to the tin basin where she kept the snowmelt. She dipped a cloth into the icy water and came back to him. "Give me your hands," she said. Jonah hesitated. He was not used to being touched. He was not used to kindness, but the pain was a dull roar in his palms. He held them out. Millie wrapped the cold, wet cloth around his blistered skin. The relief was instant and sharp. She held his hands in hers, her fingers cool and small against his battered knuckles. They stood there in the dim light, the smell of smoke and ozone hanging in the air. For the first time, they were close. Not because they wanted to be, but because the room was small and the cold was a physical enemy pressing in from the walls. Millie was shivering. The cold draft had cut through her thin dress. Jonah felt the tremor in her hands. Without thinking, he stepped closer, blocking the draft from the window with his broad shoulders. He let his body heat radiate toward her. "You are freezing," he said. "I am fine," she whispered. But she did not pull her hands away. She leaned toward him, just an inch, drawn to the warmth like a moth. They stood like that for a long time, the storm raging outside, the silence inside shifting from hostile to something shared. That night, the exhaustion broke their silence. They sat on the floor near the stove, the only warm place left. The darkness loosened their tongues. Millie spoke first, her voice low, as if telling the story to the fire rather than to Jonah. "I was born in a camp north of Leadville." She said, "My mother was Cree. She prayed to the spirits of the wood. My father was French. He prayed to a Catholic God he did not really believe in." She paused, tracing a crack in the floorboard. "When my mother died, the town made sure I knew what I was. Too French for the Indians, too Indian for the whites. I was the half-breed girl, the one who did not belong in the church and did not belong in the forest. I learned early that people hate what they cannot name." Jonah listened, his eyes on the glowing grate of the stove. He understood that displacement, He felt it in his own bones. I ran away when I was 14. Jonah said. His voice was gravel. Army recruiters came through. They promised a wage and a horse. I became a scout. He looked at his hands, wrapped in the cloth Millie had tied. They used me to find the camps, to find the people who looked like my grandmother. They said it was duty. They said it was for the safety of the territories. He fell silent, the weight of the memory pressing down on him. And you believed them? Millie asked softly. I was young, Jonah said, and I was hungry. By the time I stopped believing them, I had seen too much blood. It does not wash off. Millie, you can scrub until the skin is raw, but the stain is under the surface. Millie looked at him. She saw the lines of guilt etched into his face, deeper than the scars. She realized then that his silence was not emptiness. It was a heavy curtain drawn over a room he could not bear to look at. We are a pair, aren't we? Millie said, a sad smile touching her lips. A ghost and a mapmaker with no country. The blizzard broke 2 nights later, but the danger did not. The clear sky brought a cold so profound it cracked the trees. And it brought the wolves. They came after midnight, drawn by the scent of the hair Jonah had dressed. At first, it was just a sound, the crunch of paws on the crust, the snuffling at the door. Then came a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jonah was awake instantly. He rolled out of his blankets, grabbing the Winchester. Stay down, he commanded. Millie sat up in bed, clutching the quilt to her chest. How many? Enough, Jonah said. They are hungry. They smell the meat. The scratching at the door grew frantic. A heavy body slammed against the wood. The latch rattled. Jonah moved to the window. He scraped a small hole in the frost. Outside, in the moonlight, he saw them, 5 of them. Gaunt, gray shadows circling the cabin. One was digging at the foundation logs. If they get under the porch, they will tear the floor up. Jonah said. He checked the load in the rifle. I have to go out. No, Millie said, her voice rising. Jonah, do not. If I do not, they will be here all night. And more will come. He pulled his heavy coat on, jamming his hat low. He looked at Millie. Bar the door behind me. Do not open it unless you hear my voice. If something else tries to come in, you shoot it. Do you understand? Millie nodded, her face white as the snow outside. Jonah slipped the latch and kicked the door open. He stepped out into the biting air. The rifle raised. The wolves turned as one. The leader, a massive male with a scarred ear, snarled and dropped low. Jonah did not hesitate. He fired. The crack of the rifle echoed off the cliff face like thunder. The leader yelped and spun, biting at its flank. The others scattered but did not run. They circled, emboldened by starvation. One of them lunged from the shadows of the woodpile. Jonah swung the rifle barrel, clubbing the beast aside, but claws raked across his shoulder, tearing through the wool coat and into the flesh beneath. Jonah grunted, staggering back. He worked the lever of the rifle, chambering another round. He fired again, dropping the attacking wolf in the snow. The scent of powder and fresh blood filled the air. The remaining wolves, sensing a fight that would cost them too much, turned and vanished into the tree line, melting into the dark. Jonah stood on the porch for a moment, breathing hard, the adrenaline singing in his veins. He grabbed the dead wolf by the scruff of the neck and dragged it onto the porch, a warning to the others. Jonah! Millie's voice came from inside, tight with panic. He knocked on the wood. It is me. Open up. The bar slid back. Jonah stumbled inside. He kicked the door shut and leaned against it. Blood was soaking the shoulder of his coat, dark and wet. You are hurt, Millie said. She was at his side instantly, her hands fluttering over the tear in the fabric. It is a scratch, Jonah said, though it burned like fire. Sit, Millie ordered. She sounded like the doctor she had never been allowed to become. Jonah sat on the stool. Millie peeled the heavy coat off him, then the flannel shirt beneath. The claws had raked 3 deep furrows across his deltoid muscle. It was ugly, but not deep enough to sever the muscle. Millie worked quickly. She poured some of the precious corn whiskey Jonah kept for medicinal purposes onto a clean rag. "This will sting," she warned. "Do it," Jonah said. She pressed the cloth to the wound. Jonah hissed, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He did not pull away. Millie cleaned the blood with a gentleness that made Jonah's throat tighten. It had been years, decades, maybe, since anyone had touched him with the intent to heal rather than to harm. Her fingers were steady, careful not to press too hard on the raw edges. She fetched a needle and thread from her tin. "I have to stitch it," she said. Jonah nodded. He watched her face as she worked. She was biting her lip in concentration. The firelight caught the hollow of her throat and the loose strands of hair that framed her face. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a thawing that was more painful than the freezing had been. He was trusting her. He was sitting here, half naked and bleeding, letting this woman sew him back together. "Why did you run?" "Millie?" Jonah asked quietly. The pain of the needle was sharp, but it cleared his head. Millie paused, the needle hovering over his skin. She did not look up. "There is a man," she said, "a powerful man. He owns the sawmill. He owns the sheriff." "Silas Pritchard?" Jonah guessed. He had heard the name in town, the man who owned half the county. Millie nodded. "He saw me in town 6 months ago. He decided he wanted me. He sent gifts. I sent them back. He came to my room at the boarding house. I locked him out." She resumed stitching, her hand shaking slightly now. "When a man like that is refused, he does not just walk away. He destroys. He told people I was a whore. He told the shopkeepers not to sell to me. He said I was dirty, that I was asking for it. The town believes what he pays them to believe." She tied off the knot and snipped the thread. She looked up at Jonah, her eyes wet but fierce. "I am not what they say I am." "Jonah?" Jonah looked at the stitches. They were neat and even. He looked at Millie. "I know," he said. His anger was a cold, quiet thing in his gut. It was the kind of anger that did not shout. It was the kind of anger that loaded a gun. "No one takes what isn't given," Jonah said. It sounded like a law older than the courthouse down in Silverton, a law written in the rock and the timber. In the days that followed, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. The air grew heavy with something unspoken, a craving built between them, filling the small space. Jonah found himself watching her hands as she mended his shirt. Millie found herself watching the way Jonah moved, the easy strength in his back as he lifted the heavy cast-iron pot. They avoided looking at each other too long. To look was to acknowledge the pull, and to acknowledge the pull felt dangerous. It felt like stepping off the edge of the cliff outside. They were two wounded people, and desire felt like a luxury they could not afford. It felt like hope, and hope was terrifying. One night, the wind died down, leaving a silence so deep it rang in the ears. They were asleep, Jonah in his corner, Millie on the bed. Millie woke with a gasp. It was a sharp, strangled sound, as if she were drowning. She sat up, clawing at her throat, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was caught in a nightmare, trapped in some memory of a door breaking down or a hand grabbing her wrist. "No," she whimpered. "No, please." Jonah was there in a second. He did not grab her. He did not shake her. He sat on the edge of the bed, his presence a solid wall against the dark. "Millie," he said softly, "you are safe. You are on the ridge." She looked at him, her chest heaving, sweat beading on her forehead. The terror in her eyes was slowly replaced by recognition. She saw Jonah. She saw the man who had stood between her and the wolves. She trembled, a violent shudder that shook her whole frame. Jonah reached out. He did not ask. He simply wrapped his arms around her. She collapsed against him. She clutched his shirt, her fingers digging into the fabric as if he were the only solid thing in a world of sliding scree. Jonah held her. He felt the warmth of her body through her thin nightdress. He smelled the scent of pine smoke and sage in her hair. He realized then, with a jolt, that nearly knocked the wind out of him, that he wanted to be her shelter. He did not just want to survive the winter. He wanted to stand between her and the world. They stayed like that until her breathing slowed. When she finally pulled back, she looked up at him. Her face was inches from his. The air between them crackled. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah nodded. He stood up and went back to his corner, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, brilliant and blinding. Millie was making coffee. She dropped a spoon, and it clattered loudly on the floor. She jumped, then looked at Jonah and let out a short, sudden laugh. "I am jumpy as a squirrel," she said. Jonah looked at her. He had never heard her laugh. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it transformed her face. It made her look younger. It made the cabin feel less like a grave and more like a home. Jonah watched that laugh like it was a sunrise he thought the world had forgotten how to make. Later that day, Jonah was checking the floorboards near the hearth. The draft was bad there. He noticed the board Millie had been sitting near on the first night, the one that sat slightly uneven. He wedged his knife into the crack and pried it up. "What is it?" Millie asked, coming to stand beside him. Jonah lifted the board. Beneath it, nestled in the dust and mouse droppings, was a packet wrapped in oilskin. He lifted it out. It was heavy. He unwrapped the oilskin on the table. Inside was a folded map, faded and stained with water. There was a small leather ledger, and there was a letter, sealed with red wax. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky and old-fashioned. To Jonah Crow. Jonah stared at it. "How?" Millie gasped. "That is Etienne's writing?" Jonah broke the seal. He unfolded the paper. The date was from 6 months ago. "Jonah," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then you are the damn fool I hoped you would be. You bought the cabin. Good, the girl, Millie. She is my goddaughter. Her father was my partner before the drink took him. I promised him I would keep her safe, but I am dying. Jonah, the cough has me, and there are wolves in this town worse than the gray ones on the ridge. Do not trust the sheriff. He is Pritchard's dog. And do not think this is just a cabin. What is hidden in these walls is the key to everything. Millie's life is tied to it. Keep her safe, and the claim is yours. Signed, Etienne Leroux." Jonah lowered the letter. He looked at the map. It showed the ridge, but it had markings on it that did not match the official surveys. Millie looked at him, her face pale. "He knew," she said softly. "Etienne told me," he said. "When the cabin is safe on paper, Jonah will come. I did not know how he knew your name. I thought he was just telling stories to keep me from being afraid." She looked at Jonah with wide eyes. "I waited because I had nowhere else to wait." Jonah looked at the letter, then at the woman. He looked at the walls of the cabin he had bought for $1. He realized then that the price had been a lie. The cabin was not a bargain. It was a fuse. Etienne had set a trap for the men who wanted to destroy Millie, and he had used Jonah as the match to light it. Jonah folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He looked at the door. The winter was far from over. "We are not just hiding anymore." "Millie," Jonah said, his voice grim. He placed his hand over hers on the table. "We are holding the match." The weather broke on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the blizzard had sealed the cabin on Black Pine Ridge like a tomb. The wind, which had been a constant, screaming presence against the logs, suddenly dropped to a sullen whisper. The sky lifted, trading the heavy, bruising purple of the storm for a flat, steel gray that promised nothing but a pause in the violence. Jonah Crow stood on the porch, testing the air. It was still cold enough to freeze breath in the throat, but the bite was different. It was the stillness of a predator waiting to strike again. He looked down at his own shoulder. The wolf bite was angry. Despite Millie's stitching and the poultices of pine sap and boiled bark, the wound was hot to the touch, the skin around it tight and red. It needed a doctor, or at least medicine better than whiskey and hope. Inside, the flour sack was folded over, nearly empty. The coffee was gone. and Millie's hands were cracked raw from the dry cold and the scrubbing of rough fabric. The skin split deep enough to bleed when she made a fist. "We have to go down," Jonah said, turning back into the room. Millie looked up from the stove. She was pale, the hollows under her cheekbones more pronounced than they had been a month ago. "You mean you have to go down?" she said. Jonah nodded. "I will take the pack horse. I can be back before nightfall if the trail holds. You stay here. Keep the door barred." "No," Millie said. It was a quiet word, but it stopped Jonah in his tracks. He looked at her. She was standing straight, her chin lifted in that stubborn way he had come to recognize, and, secretly, to admire. "Millie," Jonah said, his voice low and reasonable. "There are men down there who want to put you in a cell, or worse, if you show your face. Pritchard will know exactly where you are. Let him know," Millie said. She walked over to him, her eyes hard. "I am tired of living like a ghost. Jonah, I am tired of jumping at shadows and wondering if every sound in the wind is a deputy coming to drag me away. If I stay here alone, listening to the silence, I will go mad. I would rather face fear than rot in it." Jonah looked at the resolve in her face. He saw the tremble in her hands she was trying to hide, but he saw the steel in her spine too. He knew that look. It was the look of a soldier who was done digging trenches and ready to charge, even if the charge was suicide. He sighed, a rough sound that scraped his throat. "If you come, you do exactly what I say," Jonah said. "You do not speak to anyone. You stay close enough to me that a knife cannot pass between us." "I can do that," Millie said. Jonah went to the peg by the door and took down his spare coat. It was a heavy buffalo hide coat, immense and shaggy, smelling of wood smoke and old tobacco. He held it out. "Put this on," he said, "and wrap your head. You look like a trapper's boy, not Millie LaRue. She put the coat on. It swallowed her whole. The sleeves hung past her hands, and the hem dragged near her ankles. She wrapped a woolen scarf around her head and neck, pulling it up until only her eyes and the bridge of her nose were visible. Jonah checked his revolver. He spun the cylinder, checking the loads. 5 beans in the wheel. Hammer down on an empty chamber. He slid it back into the holster and tied the leather thong over the hammer. "Let's go," he said. The descent was a nightmare of slush and treacherous ice. The trail, barely a scratch on the side of the mountain, was slick with runoff where the sun had touched it and hard as iron in the shadows. They rode in silence. Jonah leading on his bay gelding, Millie following on the pack horse. They took the old game trail that cut behind the ridge, a path used only by deer and desperate men. It added an hour to the ride, but it kept them off the main wagon road where the timber crews moved. When they finally broke out of the tree line and saw the town of Silverton sprawled in the valley below, it hit them like a physical blow, after the profound, living silence of the high ridge. The town was a chaotic assault. The air was thick with the acrid yellow smoke of coal fires and the smelter stacks. The noise was a dull roar, steam whistles, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouting of teamsters, the bark of dogs. Millie stiffened in the saddle. Jonah saw her posture tighten, her shoulders hunching under the heavy coat. She looked small against the backdrop of the noisy, dirty world. He dropped his horse back until he was riding beside her, his knee brushing the stirrup of her saddle. "Head down," Jonah murmured. "Look at the horse's ears. Do not look at the men." They rode into the slushy mud of the main street. The town was busy, filled with miners down from the high camps and railway men moving freight before the winter locked the passes for good. It was a hard town, built by hard men for the purpose of ripping silver out of the earth. There was no softness here. They tied the horses at the rail outside the mercantile. Jonah helped Millie down. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she stumbled slightly. He caught her elbow, his grip firm. "Stay with me," he said. They walked into the store. The warmth hit them first, then the smell, spices, leather, sawdust, and the sweat of unwashed bodies. The store was crowded. Jonah moved through the crowd with the fluidity of water, parting the sea of rough coats and broad backs. He kept Millie on his left side, shielding her from the room. He moved to the counter. The shopkeeper was a new man. Not the one who had overcharged him before. This one was younger, with slicked back hair and eyes that darted around the room like nervous minnows. "Sack of flour," Jonah said, his voice flat. 10 pounds of beans, coffee, and I need salve for a wound. The shopkeeper looked at Jonah, taking in the scarred face and the mountain dress. Then his eyes slid to Millie. He squinted, trying to peer past the scarf and the oversized coat. "Who is the boy?" the shopkeeper asked. Jonah did not blink. "My business. Get the goods." The shopkeeper hesitated, bristling slightly at the tone, but he turned to the shelves while his back was turned. A woman in a bonnet standing near the fabric bolts leaned toward her companion. She did not whisper quietly enough. "That is him," she hissed. "The savage who bought the death cabin. Who is he with?" the other woman asked. "Some runaway. Likely. Or a squaw he picked up. You know how those mountain men are. Animals." Millie flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of her jaw, but Jonah felt it. The insult was not new to him. He had been called worse things by better people, but seeing it land on Millie felt like swallowing nails. He shifted his weight, putting his back to the women, blocking them from her view. He made himself a wall. The shopkeeper returned with the supplies and a tin of carbolic salve. "That will be $8, the man said. Jonah put the money on the counter. He did not argue the price. He just wanted to be gone. As they turned to leave, the door opened, and the winter light was blocked by a large shape. Sheriff Cable stood there. He was a thick-set man with a mustache that hid his mouth and eyes that looked like wet stones. He wore a badge that gleamed in the dim light, and a coat with a fur collar that looked too expensive for a lawman's salary. He stopped, his gaze landing on Jonah. A slow smile spread under the mustache, but it did not reach his eyes. "Jonah Crow," the sheriff said. His voice was rich and oily. "I heard you were still up there. I had a bet with the deputy that you had frozen to death by now." Jonah did not smile. "Sheriff." The sheriff's eyes drifted past Jonah and landed on Millie. He studied the buffalo coat, the scarf, the small boots peeking out from the hem. "And who is this?" Sheriff Cable asked. He took a step closer, invading their space. Jonah stepped sideways, placing himself directly in the sheriff's path. "My partner," Jonah said. "Partner," the sheriff repeated. He chuckled. "A small partner? You know, Crow. We have a person of interest missing from town. A woman, Amelie LaRue. You wouldn't have seen her up on that ridge. Would you?" Millie's breath hitched. Jonah heard it. He saw her hand drift toward the pocket of the coat where she had hidden a small knife. "I live alone," Jonah said. "Is that so?" the sheriff said. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Because Mr. Pritchard is very concerned about her welfare. She is a fragile creature, confused. She is wanted for questioning regarding some property theft. It would go well for a man who helped return her. It would go very badly for a man who hid her." The threat hung in the air, smelling of stale whiskey and menace. The store had gone quiet. People were watching. Jonah looked at the sheriff. He did not posture. He did not touch his gun. He simply stood there, radiating a stillness that was more terrifying than any shout. "If you have a warrant, show it," Jonah said. "If you do not, get out of my way." The sheriff's smile faltered. His hand twitched near his hip. "You are walking a thin line." "Crow," the sheriff said softly. "That cabin is a long way from help. Accidents happen up there." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "You speak to me," Jonah said. His voice was a blade, sharp and cold. "If you have business, you bring it to me. Do not look past me." For a long second, the two men held the stare. Then the sheriff laughed, a sharp, barking sound. He stepped back, sweeping his arm toward the door in a mock gesture of politeness. "Go on then, savage. Take your supplies. But winter is long. We will see who breaks first." Jonah took Millie's arm and guided her out. He felt her trembling under the heavy coat. "We need a doctor," Jonah said as soon as they were on the boardwalk. "My shoulder is bleeding again. They found the office of Dr. Clara Hargrove down a side street, away from the saloons. It was a small clapboard building with a clean sign. Clara Hargrove was a woman of 50 with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She was a widow who had taken over her husband's practice and then proved she was twice the doctor he had ever been. She opened the door, took one look at Jonah's pale face and the way he held his arm, and ushered them inside. She locked the door behind them and pulled the shade down. "Coat off," she ordered Jonah. She looked at Millie, who was still standing by the door, wrapped in the buffalo hide. "You too, girl," Clara said. "You are roasting in that thing, and take off the scarf. I know who you are." Millie froze. Clara sighed. "Silverton is a small town. My dear, I stitched your father's hand when he put it through a window 5 years ago. I know a LaRue when I see one. Take it off. You are safe here." Millie slowly unwound the scarf. Clara looked at her face, noting the gauntness, the fear, and the healing bruises. Her expression softened. "Sit down," Clara said gentler. "There is tea on the stove," while Clara worked on Jonah's shoulder, cleaning the infection and restitching the wound with brisk, professional movements. She spoke in a low voice. "You are playing a dangerous game." "Jonah Crow," Clara said, "that shoulder is a mess. Another week and you would have lost the arm." Jonah gritted his teeth as she poured iodine on the open flesh. "What do you know about Pritchard?" Jonah asked. Clara snorted. "I know he owns the bank, the mill, and the law. I know he thinks this valley is his personal kingdom, and I know that Etienne LaRue did not die in a hunting accident." Millie looked up from her teacup, her hands shaking. "You know?" Millie whispered. Clara tied the bandage off and wiped her hands. "I signed the death certificate because the sheriff stood over me while I did it," Clara said, her voice bitter. "But I saw the body. A bear does not shoot a man in the back of the head before mauling him." The room went deadly silent. "Why didn't you say anything?" Millie asked, her voice trembling with anger. Clara looked at her, and her eyes were sad. "Because I have 2 sons in boarding school in Denver, and Pritchard told me he would ensure they never finished their term. I am a coward. Millie, we all are. Except, it seems, for this fool here." She nodded at Jonah. "Pritchard is telling people you stole from him." "Millie," Clara continued, "he says you took a map. A claim map. He has the town convinced you are a thief and a harlot. He is erasing you so that when you disappear for good, no one will ask questions." Jonah stood up, testing his arm. It was stiff, but the pain was a dull ache now instead of a sharp fire. "Thank you, Doctor," Jonah said. Clara handed him a small bottle of laudanum. "For the pain," she said. "Get her out of here." "Jonah, they are watching the roads. Pritchard has men at the pass." "We are not going to the pass," Jonah said. "We are going back up." Clara looked at him, then shook her head with a grim smile. "Like I said, a fool." Jonah left Millie in the doctor's office for 10 minutes while he went to the livery stable to buy a fresh cinch for his saddle. He returned to find Millie pressing her ear against the wall that separated the doctor's office from the saloon next door. She waved him over, putting a finger to her lips. Through the thin wood, voices drifted in, loud and slurred with drink. "Told you, the claim is up on the North Ridge. Old man Etienne found a vein of silver thick as your leg. Never filed it, just sat on it." Another voice laughed. "Crazy old coot. Pritchard says the girl knows where the markers are. Says the old man gave her the map. We just need to find her. Pritchard put a bounty out, $500 for the girl. Dead or alive, he said, though he'd prefer alive for a few hours first." Laughter followed, crude and ugly. Millie pulled away from the wall. Her face was white, but her eyes were dry. She looked at Jonah. "It is not just hate," she whispered. "It is business. I am not just a scandal to them. I am a key." Jonah nodded. He felt a cold rage settling in his gut, heavier than lead. "They want the claim," Jonah said, "and they want you silent." Millie looked down at her hands. "I am inconvenient," she said, "because I know he murdered Etienne, and I have the proof." Jonah took her shoulders. His grip was firm. "We are leaving, now." They said their goodbyes to Clara, who pressed a small bag of dried apples into Millie's hand and told them to go with God. They moved toward the alley where the horses were tied. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. As they turned the corner into the narrow space between the mercantile and the livery, 3 men stepped out from behind a stack of crates. They were not lawmen. They were roughnecks, timbermen by the look of their caulk boots and flannel shirts. They smelled of whiskey and bad intent. "Well, look at this," the leader said. A big man with a broken tooth grinned. "If it isn't the little bird everyone is looking for." They blocked the path. Millie stepped back, bumping into Jonah's chest. "Excuse us," Jonah said. His voice was polite, but it carried the weight of a gravestone. The leader laughed. He looked at Millie, ignoring Jonah completely. "Mister, Pritchard would pay a lot to have a conversation with you." "Sweetheart, why don't you come with us? We have a warm carriage." He reached out a hand to grab Millie's arm. Jonah did not draw his gun. He did not shout. He moved with a speed that belied his size. He stepped forward, knocking the man's hand aside with his forearm, and in the same motion, he drove his knee into the man's midsection. The man doubled over with a wheeze. Jonah grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wooden wall of the livery stable. The wood cracked. The other 2 men reached for their belts. "Don't," Jonah said. He did not look at the leader he had pinned. He looked at the other 2. His eyes were flat, devoid of fear, devoid of hesitation. His hand hovered over the Colt at his hip. "If you pull those knives," Jonah said softly, "you will die in this alley, and no one will care enough to bury you." The men hesitated. They looked at Jonah's face, at the scar, at the sheer size of him. They looked at the eyes of a man who had seen death 1,000 times and made peace with it. The leader groaned, sliding down the wall. Jonah released him. He stepped back to Millie, putting an arm around her waist. "Go back to your drinks," Jonah said. "Tell Pritchard that if he wants her, he can come up the mountain himself, but tell him to bring a shovel." He guided Millie to the horses. They mounted up, their movement stiff and jerky. They rode out of the alley, leaving the 3 men staring after them in the gathering dusk. The ride back up the mountain was silent. The adrenaline that had sustained them in town began to fade, replaced by a deep, vibrating tension. They had poked the bear. They had walked into the lion's den and slapped it. By sundown, the rumors would be flying. "Jonah Crow is keeping the LaRue girl. She has bewitched him. They are thieves. They are lovers." The town would turn their survival into a dirty joke. But as they climbed higher, leaving the smoke and the noise behind, the air grew clean again. The silence of the ridge wrapped around them. They reached the cabin well after dark. The cold was intense, biting through their coats. Jonah stabled the horses, rubbing them down quickly, while Millie went inside to light the stove. When Jonah entered the cabin, the fire was roaring. The room was warm, smelling of pine and the faint, sweet scent of the dried apples Clara had given them. He barred the door. He dropped the heavy wooden beam into place with a thud that felt final. He turned to look at Millie. She had taken off the heavy coat and the scarf. She was standing by the stove, her hands held out to the heat. She was shaking. Jonah thought it was the cold, or the fear catching up to her. He crossed the room. "Millie," he said, "you are safe." She turned to face him. Her eyes were wide, dark and wild. "Safe?" she said, her voice cracking. "Did you hear them? Jonah? Did you see how they looked at me? Like I was meat, like I was nothing." She was trembling violently now. "If you hadn't been there." She whispered. "But I was there," Jonah said. He stepped closer. Millie looked up at him. She looked at the bandage on his shoulder, at the fatigue etched into his face. She reached out and touched his chest, her hand resting over his heart. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? You could have left me. You could have saved yourself." Jonah looked at her. He felt the heat of her hand through his shirt. He felt the pulse of the room, the danger outside making the air inside feel thick and heavy. He thought of the years he had spent running, the years of silence, The years of believing he was nothing but a weapon to be used and discarded. Because I was waiting too, Jonah said. He didn't know he was going to say it until the words were out. Millie's breath hitched. She stepped closer. The distance between them vanished. It wasn't a decision made by logic. It was the crash of two desperate things colliding. Millie looked at his mouth. She didn't look away. "Jonah," she whispered. He reached out and touched her face. His hand was rough, calloused, and scarred, but his touch was reverent. He traced the line of her jaw. "Are you sure?" Jonah asked. His voice was a wreck. Millie didn't answer with words. She reached up, tangled her fingers in his hair, and pulled him down. The kiss was not gentle. It tasted of fear and winter and desperate relief. It was a reclaiming. It was Millie saying, "I am not a victim," and Jonah saying, "I am not a monster." It was a hunger that had been building for weeks, fed by the cold and the silence. Jonah groaned low in his throat, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her body flush against his. She felt small and fragile, but she kissed him with a fierceness that matched his own. They moved blindly toward the bed. The world outside, the sheriff, Pritchard, the map, the danger, ceased to exist. There was only the firelight, the smell of wood smoke, and the skin of another human being against their own. They shed their clothes like shedding old skins. When Jonah lay down beside her, he hesitated, terrified of his own weight, of his own roughness. But Millie pulled him close, guiding his hands, arching into his touch. "Make me real," she whispered against his neck. They came together not with the practiced ease of lovers, but with the urgent, trembling exploration of survivors. It was an act of defiance, in a world that wanted them dead, or broken, or alone. They chose to be this. They chose to be warm. Jonah held her as if she were made of glass that he was terrified to break, but she held him back with a strength that surprised him, anchoring him to the earth. Later, deep in the night, the fire burned down to coals. The wind picked up again outside, rattling the door, but inside it was quiet. They lay tangled together under the wool blankets and the buffalo coat. Millie's head rested on Jonah's good shoulder. His arm was draped over her waist, his hand flat against her stomach. They were both terrified. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had given the town something true to whisper about. But as Jonah listened to Millie's breathing, slow and steady, he felt a peace he had never known. He was not just a man occupying a cabin. He was a man holding a life. Morning came with a brilliant, blinding light off the snow. Jonah woke first. He lay still, afraid that if he moved, the reality of the night would shatter. He looked at Millie. She was asleep, her hair spread across the pillow like dark water. She stirred and opened her eyes. She blinked, orienting herself. She saw Jonah watching her. She did not look away. She did not pull the blanket up to hide her nakedness. There was no shame in her face. She smiled, a small, tired, genuine thing, Nguyen. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Jonah replied. He looked at her, and he looked different. The flinty hardness around his eyes had softened. He looked like a man who had finally chosen something. He had chosen a side. He had chosen a fight, and he had chosen her. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "We have a lot of work to do," Jonah said. Millie nodded. She sat up, the blanket falling to her waist, the scars of her past visible but no longer defining her. "Yes," she said, "but we are not doing it alone." Jonah watched her rise, beautiful and unbroken in the morning light, and knew that he would burn the whole world down before he let anyone touch her again. The cabin on Black Pine Ridge had ceased to be a home. It had become a fortification. The romance of the isolation had worn off, replaced by the cold, metallic taste of a siege. Jonah Crow moved through the days with a grim purpose, turning the rotting structure into a trap for any man foolish enough to force the door. He reinforced the hinges with iron straps he forged in the stove's coals. He set snares along the perimeter, not for rabbits, but tripwires made of braided fishing line hidden beneath the snow, rigged to drop heavy pine boughs or make enough noise to wake the dead. Millie LaRue was changing too. The woman who had greeted him with shaking hands and a wavering rifle was gone. In her place was someone harder, forged in the heat of their shared danger. Jonah spent the mornings teaching her to shoot, not as a desperate deterrent, but as a marksman. "Squeeze," Jonah said, his voice low against her ear. "Do not pull. A pull throws the shot. Let the breath out and squeeze between the heartbeats." They stood in the clearing, the air sharp enough to freeze the inside of a nose. Millie held the heavy Winchester tight against her shoulder. She exhaled, a cloud of white steam, and fired. A pine cone 50 yards away exploded into splinters. She lowered the rifle, working the lever to eject the spent brass. It spun into the snow. "Smoking. Better," Jonah said. "It needs to be better than better," Millie said, her eyes fixed on the tree line. "It needs to be dead." Jonah watched her. He saw the way she scanned the woods, the way she kept the rifle within arm's reach even when she was kneading dough or mending clothes. She had stopped waiting for a savior and started preparing for a war. The war came closer 3 days later, arriving not with a gunshot, but with the jingle of sleigh bells. Jonah was at the window instantly, the rifle in his hands. He watched a single horse pulling a light cutter sleigh struggle up the final rise. The driver was bundled in heavy wool, a doctor's bag beside them. "It is Clara," Jonah said, lowering the hammer. "Doctor." Clara Hargrove brought more than liniment and bandages. She brought the kind of news that made the winter air feel thinner. She sat at their rough table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, her face grave. "Pritchard is moving." Clara said he filed papers at the county seat yesterday. He is petitioning to seize the entire ridge under the eminent domain statutes. He claims it is essential for the expansion of the mining district. "He can't do that," Millie said, her voice tight. "This is deeded land. Jonah bought it." Clara looked at Millie with tired, sympathetic eyes. "Pritchard has judges in his pocket. Child. He claims the cabin is a public hazard and that the current occupant," she nodded at Jonah, "is a squatter with no valid claim who is harboring a fugitive. He is building a legal cage to go with the physical one." Jonah stood by the fire, his back to the room. He was listening, but his mind was working on the geometry of the trap. "He wants the land," Jonah said. "He wants the land because he knows what is under it." Jonah turned and walked to the table. He pulled the oilskin packet from his pocket, the one they had found under the floorboard. He spread Etienne's map out on the wood. "We looked at this before," Jonah said, "but we didn't look close enough." He traced a line of ink that ran parallel to the creek bed. "This isn't a survey line," Jonah said. "It is a vein. Look at the markings." Etienne marked the elevation drops. He looked at Millie. "Your godfather didn't just find silver. Millie, he found the mother lode, and it runs right under this cabin." Clara leaned in, adjusting her spectacles. "If that is true," she said softly, "then Pritchard isn't just greedy. He is desperate. If a claim like that is registered, it would undercut his entire operation in the lower valley. We need more," Millie said. "A map is just a drawing. We need proof that he knew, proof that he killed for it." Jonah looked at the walls of the cabin. He looked at the heavy logs, hewn by hand decades ago. Etienne had lived here for 20 years. He was a man of secrets, a man who knew that paper was fragile but wood endured. The letter said the cabin was the key. Jonah muttered. He began to walk the perimeter of the room, tapping the logs with the handle of his knife. Solid, solid, solid. He reached the wall behind the bed, the darkest corner of the room. He tapped a log at waist height. Thunk. The sound was different. Hollow. Jonah drew his knife. He dug the tip into a knot in the wood. It wasn't a knot, it was a plug, cleverly carved to fit the grain. He worked it loose and pulled. A section of the log, hollowed out from the inside, came away. Inside the cavity was a metal biscuit tin. Millie's breath hitched. She moved to his side as he pulled the tin out. It was heavy, sealed with beeswax to keep out the damp. Jonah set it on the table and used his knife to pry the lid. Inside lay a thick leather ledger and a stack of loose papers, some stained with dark, rusty smudges that looked like dried blood. Millie reached for the ledger. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "It is his handwriting," she whispered. "Etienne's." She began to read, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers and the notes written in the margins. "He wrote it all down," she said, her voice rising in disbelief. "Every load of timber Pritchard stole from the federal lands. Every bribe paid to the sheriff. He has dates, amounts, names." She turned the page to the very end. "The ink was different here, hurried, jagged. September 12th, Millie read aloud. "Pritchard came to the cabin himself, offered me $5,000 for the deed. I told him to go to hell. He laughed, said he would take it one way or another. He had men in the trees. I saw them." Millie stopped. She touched the page. "If I am found dead," she read. "It was Pritchard. He means to bury the truth with me. He knows about the silver." The silence in the room was absolute. This was not just evidence of theft. It was a voice from the grave pointing a finger at a murderer. Then Millie picked up the loose papers. She stared at the dark stains on the corners. "He was bleeding when he hid this," she whispered. "He didn't die in a hunting accident. He came back here. He hid this while he was dying." A memory slammed into her, violent and sudden. She gripped the table, her knuckles white. "The night he died," Millie said, her voice sounding far away. "I was in town. I was waiting for him at the boarding house. He never came, but late that night, men came to my door." She looked at Jonah, her eyes wide with a horror that was finally making sense. They laughed. I heard them in the hallway. They said, "The old man is done. Now we just need to scare the girl off." They tried the handle. I pushed the dresser against the door. I sat there all night with a knife in my hand. Jonah looked at her, and his heart broke for the terrified girl she had been. But alongside the heartbreak, a dark, familiar shame coiled in his gut. He looked at the ledger. He saw the dates from 2 years prior. "Millie," Jonah said quietly. She looked at him. 2 years ago, he said, "Before I came back to this valley to trap, I worked a season as a guide for a survey crew." He swallowed hard, forcing the truth out. "It was Pritchard's crew. I didn't know him then. I just needed the money. I led them up the north drainage. I showed them where the timber was thickest. I helped them map the very land he stole." Millie stared at him. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. "You worked for him?" she asked. "I did," Jonah said. "I took his coin. I helped him build the map he used to bleed this mountain dry." Guilt flared in his chest, hot and suffocating. He had spent his life trying to be a good man, or at least a harmless one. But the web of corruption was so wide that he had been caught in it without even knowing. He had helped build the monster that was now hunting the woman he loved. "I didn't know," Jonah said, his voice rough. "But that doesn't change that I did it." Millie looked at his face. She saw the self-loathing there, the old scars of a man who believed he was destined to cause pain. She reached out across the table. She did not pull away. She covered his hand with hers. "You were surviving." "Jonah," she said firmly, "just like I was. Pritchard uses people. That is his sin, not yours." She squeezed his hand. "But now we know. And now we have the weapon to stop him. We have to take this to the judge, not the one in Silverton. We have to go to Durango, or Denver." "We can't," Jonah said. "The passes are 10 feet deep in snow. And if we go down to town with this now, Pritchard will kill us before we get to the train station." "We have to try," Millie cried. "This is the truth. Jonah, it is right here." "And you are alive right here," Jonah snapped. The sudden volume of his voice made Clara jump. Jonah paced away from the table, his hands in his hair. "If we go down there, we are 2 people against a town that he owns. This ledger, it's just paper until a judge sees it. Until then, it is a death warrant. I want justice too, Millie, but I want you breathing more. I am not a child to be protected." "Jonah," Millie shouted back, "I am the one he hurt. It is my life." It strained between them, the fundamental difference in their love. Millie wanted to burn the infection out, even if it meant scarring the flesh. Jonah wanted to shield the body, even if it meant letting the sickness fester a little longer to survive the night. The argument was cut short by the sound of a horn blowing from the bottom of the ridge. Jonah froze. He moved to the window. 5 men, he said, on horseback. They are coming up the trail. Clara stood up, her face pale. That will be the deputy, she said. Jonah turned to the room. Hide the ledger, he ordered. Put it back in the wall. He grabbed the rifle. Millie, get under the floorboard. Where we found the map. No, Millie said. Jonah turned to her, his eyes wild. This is not a debate. Get in the hole. I will not, Millie said. She stood in the center of the room, shaking but upright. I spent 6 months hiding in corners. I spent weeks terrifying myself that they would find me. I am done hiding in the dirt like a rat. Jonah, if they come in here, they will see me standing. Jonah looked at her. He saw that she would not be moved. She would rather die standing than live another minute in the dark. He cursed under his breath. A sharp, violent sound. Fine, he said, but you stand behind me. He replaced the log in the wall, hiding the tin. He threw the bolt on the door. He checked his revolver. Clara, sit by the fire, Jonah said. You are tending a patient. The heavy thud of a fist on the door shook the cabin. Open up, a voice shouted. By order of the county sheriff. Jonah waited a beat. Then he slid the bolt and opened the door. He filled the frame. Outside, the wind was whipping snow into swirls. 5 men sat on horses. The leader was Deputy Griggs, a man with a face like a hatchet and a reputation for enjoying his work too much. We have a warrant, Griggs said, not bothering with pleasantries. Search and seizure. We have reports of stolen property and a fugitive harboring in this dwelling. I have no fugitive, Jonah said calmly. And I stole nothing. Griggs smiled. It was a lizard smile. Then you won't mind if we look. He didn't wait for permission. He dismounted and pushed past Jonah. The other 4 men followed, crowding into the small cabin. They brought the cold and the smell of wet wool and aggression with them. Griggs stopped when he saw Millie. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her neck, her waist. He smirked. Well now, if it isn't the LaRue girl. Looking a bit thin, aren't we? Millie met his gaze. She did not flinch. Get out of my house, she said. Your house? Griggs laughed. This is a squatter's shack, and you're under arrest. Darling, for what? Clara asked, speaking up from the fireside. Her voice was sharp as glass. Griggs looked at the doctor, surprised to see her. Dr. Hargrove. Didn't know you made house calls to trash? I treat human beings, deputy, which is why I rarely have cause to treat you. Griggs's face darkened. He turned to his men. Toss the place. Find the money she stole from Mr. Pritchard. The men began to tear the cabin apart. It was a performance of intimidation. They swept the jars of beans off the shelf, shattering them on the floor. They ripped the blankets off the bed. One of them picked up Millie's sewing tin and dumped the needles onto the floorboards, grinding them under his boot heel. Jonah stood by the door, his hand hovering near his gun. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight. He wanted to kill them. He wanted to draw the Colt and empty it into Griggs's chest. But he knew that the moment he cleared leather, they would gun him down, and then Millie would be alone with them. He held his rage on a leash so tight it was strangling him. He spoke only when necessary. Careful with the stove, Jonah said, his voice flat. One of the men rummaged through a wooden crate near the foot of the bed. He paused, then stood up, holding a silver pocket watch. Well, the man said. Look what I found, engraved Spee. He held up the watch. It was shiny, expensive, and Jonah had never seen it before in his life. Planted, Jonah said instantly. Griggs took the watch. He polished it on his sleeve. Looks like theft to me. Griggs said, grand larceny. That is a hanging offense in some counties. He turned to Millie. You are coming with us. Girl. And you, Crow. For accessory. He reached for Millie, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. Millie gasped, trying to pull away. Let go of her, Jonah growled. He took a step forward. The 4 other deputies drew their guns, leveling them at Jonah's chest. Griggs laughed. You going to fight us all, hero? Stop it! Clara's voice rang out. She stood up, moving between Griggs and Millie. She was a small woman, but in that moment, She looked 10 feet tall. "Let her go, Deputy," Clara said. "Or so help me God, I will see you rot." Griggs sneered. "You have no authority here." "Doctor, I have the authority of a witness," Clara shouted. "I have examined this woman. I have documented the bruises on her body from when Pritchard's men cornered her in the alley. I have a sworn statement from her regarding the harassment." She pointed a shaking finger at Griggs. "If you drag her down this mountain without a proper judge present, I will travel to Denver myself. I will testify to the federal marshal that you and your sheriff are running a criminal enterprise. I will testify that you planted evidence in front of my eyes. Do you think Pritchard can buy the governor? Because I went to school with his wife." Griggs hesitated. The threat of the governor and the presence of a respectable witness cracked his confidence. He looked at the watch, then at Clara's furious face. He released Millie's arm. He shoved her back toward the wall. "This isn't over," Griggs spat. "We have the evidence. We will be back with a warrant from the circuit judge, and when we come back, we are burning this rat trap to the ground." He turned to his men. "Let's go." They filed out, leaving the door hanging open, the snow swirling in to cover the broken glass and the spilled beans. As soon as the sound of the horses faded, the energy in the room collapsed. Millie stood against the wall, her breathing ragged. She looked at the wreckage of their home, the smashed jars, the trampled needles. It was a violation. It was a reminder that no matter how hard they fought, the world could still kick down their door. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, and she began to sob. It wasn't the weeping of sadness. It was the deep, guttural sobbing of exhausted rage. It was the sound of a woman who had been strong for too long and had nothing left. Jonah crossed the room. He knelt beside her. "Millie," he said. She hit his chest with her fist, weakly, then harder. "I hate them," she choked out. "I hate them. I hate them." Jonah caught her hand. He pulled her into him. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "I know," he whispered. "I know." He held her while she shook. He held her while the rage poured out of her. And for the first time, he let go of his own caution. He let go of the idea that he could just survive this. "I won't let them take you," Jonah said. He pulled back to look at her. His eyes were fierce. "I don't care about the law. I don't care about the claim. I won't let them put a hand on you again. If they come back, I will kill them." Millie looked at him. She saw the truth in his face. He meant it. He would die for her. The realization settled her. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She took a breath. Clara was packing her bag, her hands shaking slightly now that the danger had passed. "You have to leave," Clara said quietly. "He will be back. Jonah, Griggs will ride straight to Pritchard. They won't bother with a warrant next time. They will come at night, and they will bring fire." Jonah nodded. He looked at the cabin. It was strong, but it was a coffin. "We can't stay here," he said. That night, the cabin felt different. The illusion of safety was gone. They were exposed. Jonah packed the saddlebags. He cleaned the guns. Millie sat on the bed, sewing the tear in her dress where Griggs had grabbed her. She looked up at Jonah. "He wanted me to be his mistress," she said suddenly. Jonah stopped wiping the revolver. He looked at her. "Pritchard," she said. "He didn't just want the land. He told me that a woman like me should be grateful for the attention of a man like him. He said I was too pretty to be poor. He said he would keep me in a house in town, and I would never have to work again. All I had to do was be available when he visited." She pushed the needle through the fabric, her voice devoid of emotion. "When I said no, he hit me, open hand, across the face. He said I was dirty, that I was a half-breed whore who didn't know her place." Jonah put the gun down. He walked over to her. He knelt between her knees. "He is wrong," Jonah said. Millie looked at him. "Is he?" she asked. "Look at us. Jonah, we are hiding in a shack. We are dirty. We are nothing to them." Jonah took her face in his hands. He ran his thumb over the scar on her cheekbone. "You are not nothing," he said. "You are the only clean thing in this whole damn valley." He looked into her eyes. "I have done terrible things. Millie, I have killed men. I have led thieves to water. I thought for a long time that I was broken, that I didn't deserve a soft place to land. He leaned his forehead against hers. But you make me want to be good. You make me want to be the man Etienne thought I was. Millie dropped the sewing. She held his face. She touched the jagged scar that ran down his jaw, tracing it like a map. It is just skin. Jonah, she whispered, it is just history. She kissed him. It was a slow, deliberate kiss. It was a seal on a pact. When they broke apart, the decision was made. It hung in the air between them, sharp and clear. We can't wait for spring, Jonah said. No, Millie agreed. We have to go to Durango, Jonah said. It is a 4-day ride, through the high pass. It will be brutal. The snow is deep. We have snowshoes, Millie said. We have horses. We have the evidence. If we stay, we die, Jonah said. If we go, we might die, Millie countered. But at least we will die trying to burn him down. They looked at the tin box on the table, the ledger, the stained papers, the fire. Preparing to leave felt like stepping off a ledge into the dark. It felt like stepping into fire, but the cabin was cold, and the fire was the only way out. We leave at dawn, Jonah said. He stood up and blew out the lamp. In the darkness, he held her hand. His grip was iron. They were two outcasts, holding a match, waiting for the sun to rise so they could light the fuse. The descent from Black Pine Ridge was not a journey. It was a controlled fall. The late winter sun offered no warmth, only a glaring, indifferent light that bounced off the ice-slicked trail. Jonah Crow rode in front, his bay gelding picking its way down the switchbacks with trembling legs. Behind him, Millie LaRue rode the pack horse, wrapped in the buffalo coat, her face hidden against the biting wind. They moved through a world that was trying to kill them. Halfway down, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the mountain exhaled a cloud of blinding white powder. The whiteout hit with the force of a physical blow, erasing the trail, the trees, and the drop-off to their left. Jonah tied a lead rope from his saddle to Millie's horse, shouting over the roar of the wind, though his words were snatched away before they reached her. For an hour, they existed only as two dark shapes tethered together in a void, navigating by the instinct of the horses and the desperate prayer that the ground would not simply vanish beneath them. When they finally broke through the cloud layer, the town of Silverton lay below them, sprawling and ugly, coughing coal smoke into the pristine valley. It did not look like a refuge. It looked like the mouth of a trap. They did not go to the livery. They did not go to the hotel. They rode the back alleys, keeping to the shadows of the warehouses and the slat-sided shacks where the miners lived. They found the small clapboard house of Dr. Clara Hargrove and knocked on the kitchen door. Clara opened it, a shotgun in her hand, her eyes hard until she saw Jonah's face. She lowered the barrel and ushered them inside, bolting the door behind them. "You made it," Clara said, her voice tight with relief. "I heard the weather turned on the ridge. I feared you were frozen. We are close to it," Jonah said, unwrapping the scarf from his face. His skin was wind-burned, his eyes red-rimmed from the glare. Clara moved efficiently, pouring coffee and pulling chairs close to the stove. She looked at Millie, who sat shivering, clutching the oilskin packet that contained the ledger. "The circuit judge is in town," Clara said without preamble. "Judge Thaddeus. He is a hard man, but he is not on Pritchard's payroll. At least, not yet. He is holding court at the Grand Imperial Hotel until the weather clears enough for the train. We need to see him," Millie said. She placed the packet on the table. "We have the proof. Clara, everything Etienne wrote." Clara looked at the packet, then at the young woman. "It will not be enough to just hand it to him," Clara warned. "Pritchard has filed an injunction against Jonah. He has painted you as a fugitive and Jonah as a kidnapper. If you walk into that hotel, the sheriff will arrest you before you get within 10 feet of the judge. Then we force them to listen," Jonah said. Clara sat down, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "I will help you," she said. Jonah looked at her. "Why? You have a practice here. Pritchard could ruin you." Clara's expression hardened. "Last winter, a boy died on my table. He was crushed in the sawmill. The foreman said it was an accident, said the boy was careless. But I saw the gears. The safety guard had been removed to speed up production. Pritchard saved $12 a day by removing that guard, and when I tried to report it, the sheriff told me to stick to bandages and leave the law to men. She looked at Millie. I am tired of watching men like Silas Pritchard decide who gets to live and who gets to die. I will stand with you. I will testify to the injuries I saw on you. Millie, I will put my name on the line. The plan was desperate, but it was all they had. They waited until mid-morning, when the town was busiest. Hoping the crowd would provide cover, they moved through the streets, Jonah and Millie keeping their heads down, Clara walking ahead. They reached the steps of the Grand Imperial, a towering structure of brick and stone. Sheriff Cable was waiting. He stood at the top of the stairs, flanked by 2 deputies. He was cleaning his fingernails with a small knife, looking bored, until he saw them. He straightened, a slow, predatory smile spreading under his mustache. Well now, the sheriff said, his voice carrying over the noise of the street. Look what the wind blew down. We are here to see Judge Thaddeus, Jonah said, stepping up to the first stair. He kept his hands away from his coat, palms open. The judge is busy, the sheriff said, and vagrants aren't allowed in the lobby, especially not kidnappers. I am not a vagrant, Jonah said. And she is not kidnapped. The sheriff descended 1 step. His hand rested on the pearl handle of his revolver. You are under arrest. Crow, for the abduction of Amélie LaRue and the theft of county property, he signaled to his deputies. Take them! Run! Jonah hissed to Millie. He shoved a deputy backward, sending the man stumbling into the sheriff. Chaos erupted. Jonah grabbed Millie's hand and they bolted, not up the stairs, but sideways, diving into the narrow alley that ran alongside the hotel. After them, the sheriff roared. They ran. The ice in the alley was treacherous. They scrambled over crates and debris, their breath tearing at their lungs. They burst out onto the side street and ran toward the rail yards, hoping to lose the pursuit in the maze of tracks and freight cars. Jonah heard boots pounding the frozen mud behind them. A shot rang out, chipping the brick wall inches from his head. In here, a voice hissed. A heavy wooden door to a blacksmith shop swung open. A large man with soot-stained skin and dark eyes beckoned them. It was Mateo, the blacksmith, a man Jonah had traded with once, a man who knew what it felt like to be looked at sideways in this town. Jonah and Millie threw themselves inside. Mateo slammed the door and dropped a heavy iron bar across it. Silence, Mateo whispered. Outside. The deputies ran past, their boots thundering on the boardwalk. They went toward the depot, one of them shouted. Mateo waited a full minute before he turned to them. He handed Jonah a ladle of water from a bucket. They are hunting you like dogs, Mateo said. They don't want us to speak to the judge, Jonah replied, wiping his mouth. Mateo nodded. Then you must make sure the whole town hears you. They waited until the deputies had moved on, then slipped out the back. They circled around, aiming for the town square where the courthouse stood opposite the hotel. They were crossing the main thoroughfare when luck ran out. A young deputy, barely 20 years old and eager to prove himself, stepped out of the saloon. He saw Millie. He didn't hesitate. He lunged, grabbing her by the back of her coat. Got you, he shouted. Millie screamed, twisting in his grip. The coat tore. The deputy laughed, yanking her back so hard she fell to her knees in the slush. Look at this, the deputy yelled to the street. The little whore came back. The street went quiet. People stopped their wagons. Shopkeepers came to their windows. The silence was sudden and heavy. Jonah stopped. He turned. He saw Millie on her knees. The deputy's hand twisted in her collar. He saw the humiliation on her face, the way the crowd watched with a mix of curiosity and cruelty. The rage that surged in Jonah was blinding. His hand went to the Colt at his hip. He could drop the deputy before the boy blinked. He could end the humiliation in a spray of red. But he saw Millie's eyes. She was looking at him, terrified not of the deputy, but of what Jonah might do if he shot a lawman. The story was written. Jonah Crow, the mad dog killer. Millie LaRue, the woman who lured him to it. Pritchard would win. Jonah took his hand off the gun. He raised both hands in the air. "Let her stand," Jonah roared. His voice was a cannon shot in the silence. "I said, let her stand." The deputy flinched, his grip loosening slightly. Jonah did not advance. He stood his ground in the center of the muddy street. "Judge Thaddeus!" Jonah shouted at the upper windows of the hotel. "Judge Thaddeus, I am calling on you!" The sheer audacity of it held the crowd. A mountain man shouting down a judge in the middle of the street. A window on the second floor of the hotel opened. A man with white hair and a stern, lined face looked out. "Who is disturbing the peace?" the judge called down. Jonah pointed at the deputy. "This man is assaulting a witness," Jonah yelled. "I have evidence of murder and theft by Silas Pritchard, and your sheriff is trying to bury it." The deputy panicked. He tried to haul Millie up. "Shut your mouth. Savage!" "No!" Clara's voice cut through the air. Clara pushed through the crowd. She walked straight to Millie and the deputy. She carried her medical bag like a shield. "Let her go," Clara demanded. The deputy hesitated. Clara knelt beside Millie. She turned to the crowd, to the judge watching from above. "Look at her," Clara shouted. She pulled Millie's sleeve up, revealing the old, yellowing bruises on her wrist. She touched the scar on Millie's cheek. "This woman has a fractured rib that is still healing. She has contusions on her arms consistent with being restrained. These are not the marks of a criminal. These are the marks of a victim." The crowd shifted. People looked at their boots. The comfortable lies they had told themselves, that Millie was trouble, that she was wild, were cracking under the weight of Clara's furious diagnosis. Judge Thaddeus disappeared from the window. A moment later, the hotel doors opened, and he walked out onto the steps. "Bring them here," the judge ordered. Sheriff Cable appeared from the side street, breathless and red-faced. "Judge, this is a misunderstanding. These are dangerous fugitives." "Bring them here." "Sheriff," the judge repeated. "Now!" They gathered on the wide stone steps of the hotel. The street was packed now. It was a courtroom without walls. Millie stood up. She shook off Clara's hand gently. She stepped forward to face the judge. She was trembling, her dress muddy, her hair wild, but she did not look down. "My name is Amélie Leroux," she said. Her voice was thin, but it carried, "Silas Pritchard killed my godfather, Etienne. And when I refused to be his mistress, he destroyed my name so no one would believe me when I told the truth." She looked at the crowd, meeting the eyes of the shopkeeper who had sneered at her, the women who had whispered. "I am not asking for your pity," she said. "I am asking you to look at what you allowed to happen." The silence was absolute. Then, a carriage clattered up the street. The door opened, and Silas Pritchard stepped out. He was a handsome man, dressed in a fine wool coat with a silk cravat. He smiled, a smooth, practiced expression of confused amusement. "Judge Thaddeus," Pritchard said. Walking up the steps, "I must apologize for this spectacle. It seems my charity toward the Leroux family has been twisted by a disturbed young woman and her companion." He gestured to Jonah with a dismissive wave. "This man is a drifter, Judge, a predator who found a vulnerable girl alone in a cabin. He has clearly manipulated her, filled her head with fantasies to extort money from me. It is a tragedy. Really." He looked at the crowd, his smile tightening. "We should not be airing this filth in public. Sheriff, arrest them." Prejudice was his shield. He offered the town a way out, a way to believe that the rich man was good and the poor man was bad. Jonah stepped forward. He reached into his coat. The sheriff's hand went to his gun. "Drop it!" Jonah pulled out the metal tin. He pulled out the ledger. He did not speak to Pritchard. He handed the ledger to the judge. "Read the last entry," Jonah said. Pritchard's smile vanished. He recognized the book. "That is stolen property," Pritchard shouted. He lunged forward. "That is mine." He grabbed for the book in the judge's hands. The judge pulled back. Pritchard, in a panic, shoved the judge. Jonah moved. He threw himself between Pritchard and the judge, using his body as a barrier. "Burn it!" Pritchard screamed to his men. "Grab it and burn it!" Two of Pritchard's hired hands, men dressed as civilians, rushed the steps. One of them swung a heavy walking stick, striking Jonah across the head. Jonah staggered, blood running into his eye, but he did not step back. He wrapped his arms around the documents, curling his body around the truth. He took another blow to the ribs. He grunted, but stayed standing. "Order," the judge bellowed. "I will have order." Sheriff Cable stood frozen, watching his patron assault a federal judge. The authority he wielded began to wobble. The blacksmith, Mateo, stepped out of the crowd. Then another miner, then the shopkeeper. They didn't attack, but they formed a wall at the bottom of the steps. The town had seen enough. Pritchard fell back, panting, his face twisted in ugly rage. Jonah straightened up. He wiped the blood from his eye. He handed the loose papers to the judge. "These are the timber thefts," Jonah said, his voice steady, "and the dates of the bribes paid to the sheriff." Judge Thaddeus opened the ledger. He read the entry. He looked at the sheriff. "Sheriff Cable," the judge said, his voice like grinding stones, "you are relieved of duty pending a federal inquiry." He looked at Pritchard. "And you, sir, will not leave this town." Pritchard laughed. It was a desperate sound. "You have the word of a dead crazy man and a half-breed girl against mine," Pritchard sneered. "Who will testify to this? Who? I will." The voice came from the back of the crowd. A small man in ink-stained sleeves pushed his way forward. It was Henry, the bookkeeper from the sawmill. He looked terrified. He was shaking like a leaf, but he walked up the steps. "I will testify," Henry said softly. "I recognize the ledger. I falsified the company books to match those numbers. Mr. Pritchard told me to." The judge looked at Pritchard. "Issue the warrants," he said to the deputies who were now looking at the sheriff with confusion. Pritchard's face turned a color Jonah had never seen, a deep, violaceous red. His mask was gone. The smooth businessman was gone. "You think you can take me?" Pritchard spat. He turned his eyes on Jonah. "You believe this man?" Pritchard shouted to the crowd. "You think he is a hero? Ask him about 1864. Ask him about Sand Creek." The crowd murmured. Sand Creek was an open wound in the West. "A massacre. Ask him what he did when he wore the uniform," Pritchard yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Jonah. "He is a killer. He murdered women and children in the snow. And now he judges me?" The accusation hung in the freezing air. Millie looked at Jonah. She saw the color drain from his face. She saw the old shame rise up. The thing he had carried in the silence of the mountains for 20 years. Jonah looked at the crowd. He could deny it. He could say he was just a scout, that he didn't fire, but he was done with the lies. He was done with the shadows. "I was there," Jonah said. His voice was not loud, but in the silence, it carried to the end of the street. "I was a scout for Chivington." Jonah said, "I led the column. I thought we were tracking warriors. When we hit the camp, when the firing started, I saw what they were doing." He looked at Pritchard. Then he looked at Millie. "I didn't fire my rifle." Jonah said, "But I didn't stop them. I watched. I watched because I was a coward who followed orders. And I've seen the faces of the dead every night for 20 years. He stepped closer to Pritchard. "I know what a monster looks like. Mr. Pritchard, because I see one in the mirror, and I see one standing right in front of me." He tapped his own chest. "I cannot change what I did. I cannot bring them back, but I can stop you. I am not hiding anymore." The confession was raw. It was ugly. It did not ask for forgiveness. It simply refused to be used as a weapon. Pritchard opened his mouth, but he had nothing left. The secret he thought would destroy Jonah had only made him more real. The town looked at Jonah, scarred, bloody, admitting to a horror they all knew had happened, and they saw a human being. They saw a man trying to balance the scales. Judge Thaddeus closed the ledger with a snap. "Take Mr. Pritchard into custody," the judge ordered. The deputies hesitated, then moved. They took Pritchard by the arms. For the first time, the richest man in the valley was in irons. Millie swayed. The adrenaline that had held her upright drained away. Her knees buckled. Jonah caught her. He didn't care about the crowd. He didn't care about the blood on his face. He caught her and held her against him. "I got you," he whispered. Millie looked up at him. She saw the man who had just torn open his own soul to save her. She took his hand, the hand that had led soldiers, the hand that had chopped wood, the hand that had held her in the dark. She held it up in plain sight. She did not let go. The town watched them. They didn't cheer. This wasn't a parade. It was something heavier. It was the shift of the world on its axis. The hinge of justice had turned, rusted and screaming. But it had turned. "We need to get you to Clara's," Jonah said softly. Millie nodded. She leaned against him, and together they walked down the steps, parting the crowd not as outcasts, but as the only two people in Silverton who were completely free. The spring of 1887 did not arrive with a gentle greening of the hills. It arrived with a roar. The deep snowpack that had buried the San Juan Mountains for 5 months began to liquefy under a relentless sun. The creeks, usually polite trickles of clear water, turned into brown, churning monsters that chewed at their banks and carried whole trees downstream. The world felt raw, stripped of its white blanket, exposing the mud, the rock, and the debris of the long winter. It was a fitting backdrop for the truth they had dragged down from the mountain, a truth that was just as ugly and just as undeniable as the mud in the streets of Silverton. The formal hearing took place in the county courthouse, a building that smelled of damp wool, coal smoke, and nervous sweat. Judge Thaddeus presided from a high bench, his face carved from granite, his eyes missing nothing. The room was packed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the back walls, and women from the Temperance League sat in the front rows, their bonnets like a row of judgmental tombstones. They had come for a show. They had come to see the savage mountain man and the fallen woman. They had come to watch Silas Pritchard crush them. But the hearing did not go as Pritchard had planned. Jonah sat at the plaintiff's table, uncomfortable in a borrowed suit that was too tight across the shoulders. He sat still as a stone, his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed forward. Beside him sat Millie. She wore a simple gray dress that Clara had altered for her. She looked thin, but her spine was straight. She did not look at the crowd. She grounded herself in Jonah's presence, in the heavy warmth of him beside her. Pritchard's lawyer was a man named Sterling, imported from Denver. He was slick, loud, and theatrically cruel. He did not attack the evidence first. He attacked Millie. "Miss LaRue," Sterling said, pacing in front of the witness box, "is it not true that you were living alone in a cabin with Mr. Crow for 3 months, unwed, unchaperoned?" "It is true," Millie said. Her voice was steady, though Jonah saw her hands gripping the rail. "And is it not true," Sterling continued, smiling at the jury, "that you have a reputation in this town? That you were known to entertain men? That you sought the attention of wealthy benefactors like Mr. Pritchard?" "Objection." Jonah's lawyer, a court-appointed man who looked terrified, squeaked, sustained. The judge rumbled. "Stick to the facts. Mr. Sterling, these are facts of character." "Your Honor," Sterling boomed, "this woman is a manipulator. She seduced a lonely drifter, convinced him to forge these documents, and is now trying to extort a respected businessman. She is painting a lover's quarrel as a criminal conspiracy." He turned back to Millie, leaning in close. "Did you not invite Mr. Pritchard to your room? Did you not ask him for money? And when he refused your advances, did you not run away to play the victim?" The courtroom murmured. This was the narrative they knew. It was easier to believe a woman was loose than to believe a rich man was a monster. Millie looked at Sterling. Then she looked at Pritchard, who sat smirking at the defense table. She thought of the cold nights. She thought of the wolves. She thought of Jonah standing between her and the door. "I invited no one," Millie said. Her voice cut through the murmuring. "Mr. Pritchard came to my door uninvited. He offered me money to be his property. When I refused, he promised to destroy me." She looked up at the gallery. "You call me a fallen woman because it is easy. It makes you feel safe. If I am bad, then you do not have to worry that a man like him could hurt a woman like you. But my life is my own. I did not sell it, and I will not let you write my story for me anymore. Jonah watched her, pride swelling in his chest so hot it nearly burned. She was not the trembling girl he had found in the cabin. She was iron. Then came the evidence. Doctor. Clara Hargrove took the stand. Sterling tried to dismiss her as a hysterical woman, but Clara was a wall of medical fact. I examined Miss LaRue. Clara testified. She held up a diagram. These fractures are consistent with a fall caused by force. These bruises on her wrists are consistent with restraint. And the laceration on her face matches the ring Mr. Pritchard wears on his right hand. She pointed at Pritchard. These are not the marks of passion, Mr. Sterling. They are the marks of brutality. I have treated mining accidents that did less damage to a body than this man did to her spirit. The room grew quieter. The women in the front row stopped fanning themselves. Then came Henry, the bookkeeper. He was sweating so much his collar was soaked. He spoke in a whisper, but the judge made him repeat every word. He told me to change the numbers. Henry stammered. The timber from the federal land. We marked it as private stock, thousands of logs. And the payments to the sheriff. We listed them as security expenses. The ledger Jonah had pulled from the wall was entered into evidence. It was passed to the jury. They saw the dates. They saw the amounts. They saw the theft of their own county's resources laid out in black ink. But the final nail was the letter from Etienne. The judge read it aloud. The dead man's voice filled the room. Warning of the silver. Warning of the murder. Pointing a finger from the grave. Pritchard stood up. His face was purple. "This is a lie," he shouted. "This is a conspiracy." "Sit down." "Sir," the judge bellowed. "I will not sit down for a court of fools," Pritchard roared. He looked at the sheriff, his sheriff, but Cable was gone. Suspended and replaced by a federal marshal who stood by the door. Pritchard looked at the exits. He looked at the faces of the townspeople. He saw no admiration there anymore. He saw only the dawning realization that they had been played. He moved fast. He shoved his own lawyer into the bailiff, creating a stumble of bodies. He vaulted the railing of the gallery and bolted for the side door. "Stop him!" the marshal shouted. Jonah was already moving. He didn't wait for the law. He vaulted the table and ran. Pritchard made it to the street. He had a horse tethered there, a fast roan. He scrambled into the saddle and kicked the beast into a gallop, tearing through the mud, heading south toward the pass. Jonah ran to the hitching rail where his bay was waiting. He swung up, not bothering to untie the lead rope. Just slashing it with his knife. "He is heading for the gorge," someone shouted. Jonah kicked the bay. The horse, sensing the urgency, launched forward. The mud flew in heavy clods. The chase was not a sprint. It was a slog. The road out of town was a quagmire of slush and runoff. Pritchard was ahead by 200 yards, whipping his horse mercilessly. Jonah rode low, urging his mount with his knees, his eyes locked on the figure ahead. The marshal and 2 deputies were behind him, but Jonah had the lead. They climbed the road toward the gorge. The air grew colder. To the left, the drop-off into the Animas River was steep and terrifying, the water below a white torrent of snowmelt. Pritchard's horse was fast, but it was panicked. It slipped on a patch of ice hidden under the mud. The horse stumbled, going down to one knee. Pritchard was thrown. He hit the ground hard, rolling toward the edge of the cliff. He scrambled up, his fine coat covered in muck, his face wild. He reached for the pistol in his belt. Jonah pulled his horse up, sliding to a halt 10 yards away. He was off the saddle before the horse stopped moving. He drew his Colt. "Drop it!" Jonah yelled. Pritchard held the gun, his hands shaking. He looked at Jonah. He saw the mountain man, the savage, the soldier he had tried to shame. "You won't shoot," Pritchard sneered, though his voice cracked. "You want to be the hero, don't you? You want to prove you are civilized." Jonah cocked the hammer. The sound was loud in the canyon. "I don't have to prove anything to you," Jonah said. "Drop the gun." Pritchard laughed. It was a jagged, broken sound. "I own this town. I built it. You are nothing. You are just a killer who got lucky." He raised the pistol. Jonah could have killed him. He had the shot. It would have been clean. It would have been easy. It would have ended the threat forever. The old Jonah, the scout who followed orders, might have done it. But Jonah looked at the man shivering in the mud. He looked at the pathetic, small creature that was stripped of his money and his lies. Jonah didn't fire. He stepped forward, the barrel of his Colt never wavering. "Shoot me!" Pritchard screamed. "Do it! Make me a martyr!" "No!" Jonah said. He rushed the gap. Pritchard fired, but his hand was shaking so badly the shot went wide, hitting the dirt. Before he could cock the hammer again, Jonah was on him. Jonah slammed into him, knocking the wind out of him. He knocked the gun away. He grabbed Pritchard by the lapels of his expensive coat and slammed him into the mud. He held him there, his forearm pressing down on Pritchard's throat. Pritchard thrashed, clawing at Jonah's face, screaming obscenities. Jonah held him. He didn't strike him. He didn't strangle him. He used his strength to restrain, not to destroy. The marshal rode up, sliding from his horse with handcuffs ready. "I have him," Jonah said, breathing hard. "I have him." They shackled Pritchard. The man was weeping now, stripped of his dignity, reduced to a common criminal covered in filth. Jonah stood up. He wiped the mud from his hands. He looked down at Pritchard. "The law will do its job," Jonah said. "Even if it is late." He looked back toward the town. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't a savage. He was a man who had kept his promise. The aftermath was not a parade. There were no banners. Pritchard was denied bail and locked in the federal holding cell. The sheriff was formally indicted. The town council resigned in disgrace. But the town of Silverton did not magically heal. The fractures ran deep. There were those who could not unsee the truth, the shopkeepers who had been cheated, the families who had lost sons to the unsafe mill. They looked at Jonah and Millie with a grudging, awkward respect. But there were others, the people who hated being wrong, the people who missed the easy money Pritchard had brought. They still whispered. They still crossed the street when Millie walked by. 2 days after the trial, Jonah and Millie stood on the porch of Clara's house. The sun was out, warm for the first time in months. "We could go," Jonah said. He looked west. "We could go to California. Or Oregon, somewhere nobody knows us. Somewhere the name LaRue means nothing." Millie looked at him. She looked at the town that had tried to break her. Then she turned and looked up at the mountains. She looked at the jagged peak of Black Pine Ridge, still capped in white against the blue sky. "No," Millie said. Jonah watched her. "Why?" "Because I am done running," she said. She took his hand. "Etienne found that silver for me. He died for it. If we leave, Pritchard wins. If we leave, we are saying that we don't belong here." She looked at Jonah, her eyes clear and fierce. "We bought that cabin. Jonah, we paid for it with $1 in a winter of hell. It is ours." Jonah looked at the ridge. He thought of the wind, the silence, the hard work waiting for them. He thought of the peace he had found there, even in the middle of the storm. "It will be hard work," Jonah said. "The roof needs shingling. The floor is rotted. The trail is washed out." "I am not afraid of work," Millie said. Jonah smiled. It was a rare, open thing that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I know," he said. "They packed the horses. They bought supplies, enough for a season, paid for with the remaining money from Jonah's trapping. They rode out of town on the main street. They did not hide in the alleys. They rode with their heads up. The climb back to the ridge was a reclamation. The snow had melted enough to reveal the earth, black, rich, and smelling of pine needles and thaw. The creek was roaring, alive and violent. When they reached the cabin, it looked small and battered. The door was hanging off one hinge where the deputies had kicked it. The windows were dark. It looked like a ruin. But to Jonah and Millie, it looked like a castle. They started that very afternoon. Jonah fixed the hinge. Millie swept the broken glass and the debris from the floor. They built a fire in the stove, and the smell of wood smoke, their smoke, claimed the space again. The spring became a season of building. The silver claim was legally theirs now, filed with the federal court, but they didn't rush to mine it. They had enough to live. They focused on the home. Jonah felled cedar trees and split shakes for the roof. He worked with his shirt off in the warming sun, his muscles moving with the rhythm of the axe. Millie watched him sometimes, pausing in her gardening to admire the man who had stood by her. She planted a garden in the patch of sunlight near the cliff wall. Potatoes, carrots, peas. She began to sow again, not for the shopkeepers who sneered, but for herself. She made curtains for the windows. She made a new shirt for Jonah. Their romance grew into a daily, lived intimacy. It wasn't the desperate, frantic clinging of the blizzard. It was quieter. It was Jonah bringing her a cup of coffee in the morning before she asked. It was Millie rubbing liniment into his scarred shoulder after a long day of chopping wood. It was the laughter that surprised them both. Millie laughing when Jonah tried to explain the difference between a spruce and a fir and got tangled in his own words. Jonah chuckling when Millie chased a marmot out of her garden with a broom, swearing in French. Desire remained intense, but it was rooted in trust now. At night, when the wind howled around the eaves, they reached for each other not to escape fear, but to affirm life. Their lovemaking was slow and deep, a language of gratitude and possession. They belonged to each other, and that belonging made them invulnerable. Jonah started trading his pelts again. He didn't go to the big mercantile. He traded with Mateo, the blacksmith, and with a few independent trappers who admired a man who could bring down a wolf and a tycoon in the same winter. He traded fairly, refusing to bend to the bullies who tried to set prices. One afternoon in late May, a rider appeared on the trail. It was a man named Crouch, a neighbor from the valley below who had been one of Pritchard's vocal supporters. He rode up to the edge of the clearing, looking at the repaired cabin, at the garden, at the smoke rising from the chimney. Jonah was chopping wood. He rested the axe on a stump and walked to the edge of the porch. Millie came out of the door, holding the rifle, not aiming it, just holding it comfortably in the crook of her arm. Crouch spat on the ground. "You two are still here," he said. "We are," Jonah said. Crouch shifted in his saddle. "Some folks don't like it, think it's unnatural. A man like you living with a woman like her." Jonah looked at Crouch. He looked at the man's petty, small eyes. "Folks can think what they want," Jonah said. "But this is deeded land, and the road is public. If you have business, state it. If you don't, turn that horse around." Crouch scowled. "You think you won just because Pritchard is in jail? Accidents still happen. Crow, fences get cut. Barns burn." Jonah took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "If a fence gets cut, I will fix it," Jonah said. "If a barn burns, I will rebuild it. But if you come up here threatening my wife, Mr. Crouch, you won't make it back down the mountain." Millie stepped up beside him. She didn't hide behind him. She stood shoulder to shoulder. "We are not going anywhere," Millie said. "Tell your friends that. We are home." Crouch looked at them. He saw the axe. He saw the rifle. But more than that, he saw the way they stood together, a solid, indivisible unit. He saw a strength that his small mind couldn't quite comprehend. He grunted, turned his horse, and rode away. Jonah and Millie watched him go. Then Jonah turned to her. "Wife?" Millie asked. An eyebrow raised, a small smile playing on her lips. Jonah coughed, looking suddenly shy. "I figured, well, the circuit judge is coming back through next month. I thought maybe we could make it official. If you wanted." Millie looked at him. She looked at the scars on his face, the gray in his beard, the hands that had built this life for her. "I would like that," she said softly. She leaned in and kissed him. It tasted of sunshine and pine resin. The story closes not on a perfect world, but on a real one. The mountain was still harsh. The winter would come again. Prejudice still lived in the valley below. The scars on Jonah's shoulder and Millie's heart would always ache when the weather turned cold. But as the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in gold and violet, smoke rose steadily from the chimney of the cabin on Black Pine Ridge. Inside, the stove was warm. The table was set, and two outcasts sat down to break bread in a home where neither of them had to beg to belong. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Jonah and Millie as much as I enjoyed bringing it to life for you. It is a story about the kind of love that isn't just given, but earned through grit and survival. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in the mountains, the city, across the ocean? Please leave a comment below and share your location. And if you want to hear more stories like this, tales of the frontier, of the people who lived and loved in the hard country, please subscribe to From Wild West. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep your powder dry.